there are around 5 definitions of happiness that people usually have. But I think we all start with like, happiness is getting what I need, right? If I can get what I need, I'll be happy. That's how we initially think about the world. Now, whether or not you get that or not, at some point you realize like, hey, you can have something like really good happen to you, right? And then that only satisfy you for like 1 hour. Whereas something bad happens to you, that you think about that forever.
I think pain or the avoidance of pain is a
Yes.
far more important moral consideration
Yes.
than the pursuit of pleasure. Because we are desiring beings, we are beings that desire, we are necessarily beings that suffer because desire is suffering. When you have a desire and that desire is not satisfied, you suffer.
Pain was tolerable for me because I followed the system where this is worth it in the end. But I think that only works if there's a clear direction or why for that pain. And then if you're enduring pain but like not really knowing why, that's when it turns more into suffering.
Pain doesn't have to be suffering. Like, and I repeat that all the time to myself as well, to remind myself that, you know, I think a lot of what we're doing here is trying to communicate to people that, like, hey, this doesn't have to be suffering, right? Think about it from a different perspective. Potentially things might be different. So this is part 2 of our episode with Marcus. In part 1, we talked a lot about how our perspective on systems and how that should change over the course of our lives, how systems have affected us in both negative and positive ways, as well as in society. And over the course of that conversation, it kind of evolved into how do we build happiness in your life as a system, right? Which is so exciting and so interesting to think about. How do we make happiness into something that's repeatable? It's something that is consistent in our life. And what is our own system of happiness, right? As we level up, as we mature. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It was a lot of fun. Please enjoy. So welcome to the Level Up With Us podcast. Today we have an amazing guest, Marcus, who is brought here by Jessica.
Just as a quick introduction, my name is Marcus. I am a Singaporean philosopher. So as an academic ethicist, my job is to look at, well, certain arguments that I think are not right. Or I think that, well, this is wrong because there's no way I think this is defensible. I think that this thought leads to problematic outcomes. And then I think about a better way to answer the question, and then I provide those answers. So, I mean, the easiest way to kind of really talk about this is to look at, some standard examples in moral philosophy, right? So if we talk about, well, let's look at the outside answers. We look at how people interact with each other. And we seem like, okay, there are certain virtues that we have. And we think that certain virtues are choice-worthy or praiseworthy to have.
Sure.
For example, a person's really patient, a person's really kind, and there are all these virtues that we can list. Now, that in itself might become really problematic when you really think about it. What does it mean to be patient? Like, if someone murders your family, would you be justified to be patient there? To say, I'm sure they have a reason for that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Thank you for killing my parents. Tell me how come you decided to do this.
How did that make you feel? So there are so many ways that this could be fleshed out. You don't want to be courageous to the point where you just meet your own undoing because you're so courageous. Like, look at me, I'm going to jump down this building just because I'm so courageous. Like, to what end?
Sure.
And you see, the more we think about it, obviously these are absurd cases. But real life problems arise when we take these, again, systems of thought too seriously from inside to the outside world, and we test them, right?
Yeah, sure.
So for example, we might think that, well, the greatest thing that we can do is to increase the amount of happiness among humanity, just as much as possible, just to maximize happiness. Well, then your first question is, what the hell is happiness?
Sure. And that's different to each person, right?
Exactly, right? So you might be tempted to say, well, okay, it could be a psychological state, it's a positive mental state, like just a state of X amount of neurotransmitters or a state of pleasure. That's one answer that a lot of us kind of settle with, pleasure. So, okay, we think that pleasure is something that ought to be maximized. Well, how? Because it seems to me that all of us as pleasure-capable beings now have this moral duty to make as many children as possible. Because all of them would be capable of experiencing pleasure.
Sure.
And if I think that, I think that the world would be a much better place if systems just prized increasing pleasure. Just that's all you need to care about, right? And all the laws and all the systems we're going to have would fall into this, ultimate goal of increasing pleasure in the world. Then there are some weird outcomes. Like suddenly all of us have moral duties to just become children-bearing machines.
Sure.
Because you would be increasing the amount of people in the world who can experience pleasure.
Which makes it morally right.
Which makes that morally obligatory. It's not just right.
Okay.
Right. And then you go back and say like, okay, hold up. Hold on, Marcus. Just pump the brakes on that one. That sounds a little bit strange to me, right? Because it sounds to me like I could meet a point of time in the future where there are so many people and everyone's they just have one unit of happy.
Sure.
But if you had like 1 trillion people in the world, 1 trillion people with 1 unit of happy would be a better state of affairs than 1 million people with 1,000 units of happy.
Sure. I understand that.
Mathematically, right? It's a matter of necessity in that sense. So this is actually a counter-argument by a famous philosopher called Derek Parfit, Oxford philosopher. And he calls this the repugnant conclusion in a very poetic sense. But I think that gives us a really good overview of how these systems are not just self-perpetuating, but they are self-perpetuating to a good end.
Sure.
Which I think is something that might be quite counterintuitive to some people.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's what your answer in red that reminded me of.
Oh, yeah. This episode is proudly supported by the Coast3 Family Foundation, and specifically our philosophies over at the.x3.family. If you care a lot about thinking about the world and how you might interact with it, and all the different ways that you could possibly think about a situation, different perspectives that you might have throughout your life, different ways that you might interact with different people depending on what stage of acceptance they are, and also like how you interact with your wants in life, right? What do you want and how do you go get them? Why should everyone study philosophy? Maybe that is...
Okay, I think the most succinct way I put it is it structures our thoughts in ways that are meaningful, in ways that are choice-worthy, and the most conducive for how we ought to live our lives.
I love it. Oh yeah, so if you want to check that out, please check out our philosophies over at the.x3.family. And back to the episode. No, I think it's so interesting, and I really want you to get a chance to jump into, but I just wanted to add this because I've also thought about this a lot, which is what is the definition of happiness? And what I've come down to is that there are around 5 definitions of happiness that people usually have. There is a larger proportion of people that believe in certain ones, and I'll talk about that. But I think we all start with happiness is getting what I need, right? If I can get what I need, I'll be happy. That's how we initially think about the world, right? I'm hungry, I eat something, I'm so happy. Dopamine's firing like crazy, right? Yes, I feel so good. And then you start moving towards now actually happiness is getting what I want, right? Because you start wanting things, right? I want that car, I want that house, I want that life, I want that wife, all those things that you want. And then you get those and then you think you'll be happy, right? That's what you think happiness is going to be about. Now, whether or not you get that or not, at some point you realize hey, you know what? Life isn't really about getting those things. It's more about learning, right? Some people's whole happiness is about learning. You're in academia. I think you guys can both agree with that. A lot of people I'm sure you interact with, it's just the more they learn, the more happy they are, right? Somehow the dopamine is firing because learning is just happiness to them, right? And then at some point, I think people shift towards happiness is really embracing individuality, right? Because we start looking within. We're okay, how can I express the most authentic me? And that's pretty happy for them. A lot of people hey, if I can just be that person that's most authentic me, that makes them very happy. And again, as you can see, there's probably a cutoff now of people that are experiencing this sort of happiness. I think most people are experiencing the I want things and I get the things I want, I'll be happy kind of mentality, right? Which I don't think it's bad. I just think that's normal progression.
Yep.
And then what I think the highest tier of happiness that we can possibly subscribe to is happiness is fulfillment. And to me, I would actually, if I were to make that argument, hey, all systems should conform to one thing and to get people to one place, is it happiness? I would actually prefer the definition of happiness is fulfillment so that we can get us all to fulfillment. Because fulfillment is now the nuanced thing that like is different for each person, right? It
Yep.
doesn't just rely on like the dopamine trigger. It's like, hey, what actually fulfills you? Some people like to be artists. Some people like to dance. Some people like to, philosophize, right? Like there's a lot of forms of fulfillments, right? That can possibly make your life as fulfilling as can be.
Mhm, mhm.
And to me, that's where I think like, I'd rather not have one definition of happiness, because I've interviewed so many people, I've talked to so many people. Everyone has so many different takes on happiness, and it's hard, I think, to like, it's easier once you start categorizing them into like these buckets.
I must first say, congratulations, you basically came to the same conclusion as a lot of the ancient Greeks did,
Yeah.
right? So Plato, Aristotle, they all thought that, well, happiness or the life well lived. So in ancient Greek, they called this eudaimonia.
Mhm.
The life well lived or the flourishing life is the life that meets certain conditions,
Mhm.
right? And true to form, someone like Plato would say, well, a life worth living or a life well lived is a life that forms well to what a human being is meant to be, right? It's a teleological view, we call it.
Okay, sure.
And then Aristotle is like, well, a life worth living is a life that has these virtues, because that's what humanity is for. Again, another teleological view. Aristotle was Plato's student.
Yeah.
So you've come to the same conclusion, but over the centuries, you've really been thinking, what does this whole fulfillment thing mean,
Sure.
and why is it valuable,
Mhm.
right? So this is the part that I think I'm going to play a bit of a skeptic, because I think that everything that you mentioned in terms of this kind of progression of pleasures
Mhm.
kind of is exactly that. It's just pleasures.
Mm.
We are looking at different. It might be the case that we have categorically different pleasures.
Sure.
So I think John Stuart Mill, one of the classic utilitarians, did argue that there are different types of pleasures.
Sure.
I don't agree with how he did it. He's kind of this like posh Edwardian kind of Englishman who speaks like this, probably.
Whoa.
Yeah, and he thought that there are pleasures of the swine and there are pleasures of the upper class, that kind of thing, right? So I don't agree with him.
Okay.
Obviously, he
very
thinks that,
classism.
I think that poetry is a higher pleasure.
Okay.
Stop it. But it could be the case that they are categorically different from each other. But I think that everything that we find worthy of pursuit
Mhm.
could technically be watered down into pleasure. For example, if we look at, I think what you mentioned is along the lines of a type of utility of consequentialism that we call preference satisfaction.
Okay.
Right? I have a preference, i.e., I have a need/want.
Yeah.
And good is achieved when that need/want is fulfilled.
Sure.
Then it could be, you could say, extrapolate that and say that, well, okay, the system that is best for all of us is a system that fulfills the most number of preferences.
Mm.
You satisfy the most number of preferences. That's the best system.
Okay.
And then you're like, well, okay, what if 51% of people had a preference for necrophilia?
Mm-mm.
And then you're kind of like, oh no. Like, maybe not all preferences ought to
And
be
I think
satisfied.
51% of people were like, oh yeah.
Yeah, like the Kool-Aid man, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah.
Sure.
And so you look in this possible world, and you're like, that's not a possible world I want to bring to fruition. And then you're like, okay, well, maybe it's not preference satisfaction. So then you move on and you say, well, okay, we should meet this standard of fulfillment, right? We want to meet kind of this I think one way to put it would actually be the Buddhist enlightenment.
Yes.
Right? You want to meet this enlightenment. You want to like kind of transcend your humanity.
Correct.
And one thing that's really interesting to ask is why we think that's choice-worthy.
Okay.
And the more we walk down this route of inquiry, it appears to me that at the very base of all of these desires is pleasure, or at least some perceived pursuit of this pleasure.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so that's how I might put it. So it's a view that in philosophy we call hedonism, i.e. there's only one greatest value thing, or one greatest intrinsic good, which is good in and of itself, and it's pleasure. Everything else is instrumental to pleasure. So things that you think are worth doing, well, they're worth doing because they're instrumental to pleasure.
Absolutely. Do you want to jump in or?
No, okay, go ahead.
No, okay, so absolutely. I don't disagree with that. I think hedonism is definitely something that I looked into quite a bit because I think there's a lot of there's only one thing we know, right? If we want to dumb it down to the simplest thing is like, hey, dopamine makes us do things. That is the one thing we know fundamentally, right? That is the one neurochemical. I mean, okay, I'm
Among
really
others,
oversimplifying, right?
Among others,
but like
yes.
the major
Yeah.
neurochemical that like actually makes us move and take action.
Mm.
And if we say taking action is good, then whatever triggers dopamine is good, and whatever pleasure, right? I'm going to associate that with dopamine trigger, is going to be good, right? Absolutely. If we go down that route, I would agree. I wanted to kind of tackle though the whole idea that enlightenment's like, how come that is the aspiration, and is that really the same kind of pleasure that I think comes from a dopamine instinctual trigger of like, hey, I'm hungry, give me food, I eat the food, neurons fire. The way that I see the last stage, like I said, fulfillment, I would actually very much associate that to enlightenment. So thank you for bridging those two. But what I think about that isn't necessarily like, hey, you know what? I'm in a state where like dopamine's like firing like crazy. Actually, I think of it as a state where nothing's firing, right? It's actually like an empty void. And I find peace within that state, right? And I think for me, like I've always had difficulty explaining the state to a lot of people because I don't think I'm as practiced. I'm not enlightened by any means. I'm just going to be very clear, right? I'm on the path to it potentially, but I'm not claiming anything. But like, I think the points where I am at least in enough of a meditative state to be at peace, or in a flow state, like we find ourselves in flow state all the time, right? I think those are the closest moments we have to that. And I don't remember. Your literature is probably like your literature quoting skill is much better than mine. I don't remember which literature this came from, but I think there was some test on flow state and like, was it neurochemically induced? Like, what could they tell in the brain that happened during this time? It wasn't dopamine, right? And if I'm correct, it was serotonin instead, right? And I think there's a lot of research here that is very interesting to me, which is like, what is the longest sustainable, let's even go back to pleasure that we can sustain over the course of, a day, a week, a month. We've had a lot of discussions where like you can have something like really good happen to you, right? And then that only satisfy you for like 1 hour. Whereas something bad happens to you that you think about that forever, right? Like you think about that, woke up at like 3 a.m. like, oh, why did I say that? Like so I think like dopamine by nature is supposed to be very short-lived because it's supposed to give you that burst of energy to do the thing, the next step. But what I think I'm striving for, and perhaps what I'm trying to talk about with the scale of happiness, is that long-lasting fulfillment that comes in through enlightenment, whether it be chemically, serotonin or whatever. I think that's where we can play.
I think so. Firstly, thanks for bringing up flow literature because I think that's super fascinating, right? I can't be sure of whether or not that's the single most sustainable state of happiness, right?
Sure.
Happiness as pleasure or happiness as anything. I'm not sure what's the most sustainable state. I feel like the only way we can really, really nail this down is to say that, well, the most sustainable state of, this kind of flow that you're mentioning is just non-existence.
I love it.
And you wouldn't be super out of line, I would say. Well, obviously, this is not to say that you ought to pursue non-existence in any way you can think about. But really, the idea that non-existence is the only way that we are not privy to the antithesis of pleasure, which is pain. So it feels like now we've gotten to this point where I'm going to talk about my own ethical views.
Lovely. Please.
So I always joke with my colleagues that like I'm not ready to come out of the closet yet as a utilitarian, but I do hold very utilitarian views. In fact, I hold I think a view called negative utilitarianism.
Interesting. So
what this means is that we have, utilitarianism is just the idea that you ought to maximize utility with every action that you take. So turn that around, right? Instead of maximizing utility, I think that we have a greater duty to to reduce disutility.
Okay. So reduce non-effectiveness.
No, reduce bad things.
Okay.
So non-effectiveness could be just morally like whatever.
Okay.
Right? Like if I said, well, I'm just gonna knock on this table right now. Like I don't think that's a particularly moral action. I don't think that I've done really bad. I've done a bad thing.
It's horrible. You gotta pay for that now.
How dare you? So the difference between the kind of classical utilitarianism and negative versions of utilitarianism is that it's what we call the two different types of the golden rule. One version of the golden rule is do unto others what you would have others do unto you. That's a positive golden rule.
Okay.
Right? The negative golden rule was actually first explicated, to my knowledge, by Confucius.
Okay.
He said, do not do unto others what you would have them not do unto you.
Okay.
Right? So there's inaction instead of action.
Got it.
And I think that's where a lot of moral power lies. So why do I bring all this up? Well, it appears to me that what's obviously pleasure is choice worthy. If you had again 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we can obviously rank them on which state would have the greatest amount of pleasure, we should choose that state with the greatest amount of pleasure. But what I'm more interested in is which of these states have the least amount of pain. Those are two very different metrics. It could be the case that world number 1 would have more pleasure than world number 2, but also feature more pain.
Sure. Absolutely.
Right? And then the question that arises is whether or not you think pain and pleasure are counter forces to each other. I actually hold the view that I think that pleasure is subservient to pain in terms of our moral considerations.
Okay.
I think pain or the avoidance of pain is a far more important moral consideration than the pursuit of pleasure.
Absolutely.
If you think that's the case, then it seems to me at least, that we have a certain way to arrange society so that you should not harm your neighbor. But, well, if you're going to be nice to your neighbor, that'll be nice, right? But you're not morally obliged to like maximize everyone's utility. So like, if you cook a pot of curry, like 1 million people should get a spoonful.
Okay.
But like
instead, don't pour a pot of curry onto someone's head.
Yeah, right.
And burn it. As an example.
For example, So I think that it's more important that we avoid harm than to pursue pleasure.
Interesting.
And that's then that if you think about it in terms of there's this whole flow thing, it kind of tracks, right? We're looking at the fact that this is not a person who's chasing that hit of dopamine. But first and foremost, the neuropsychology of pleasure is not that straightforward, obviously, as you've mentioned. But we're not looking for zap brain happy, right? We're looking for kind of this deeper sense of pleasure that appears to me to be a kind of sense of calm, a sense of like peace. And I think one thing that I thought was super helpful in thinking about this was a sense of equanimity. So equanimity kind of is this term that's borrowed from Buddhism. I can't say I'm a scholar in Buddhist ethics, but it's a term that I think is very helpful and borrowed because it looks at how things are. This too shall pass. Right? There's a hint of stoicism in this, but I'm not going to go into that. It's really just this idea that we are harmed, and then that's going to be bad for us, but it too shall pass. And then we try our best to reach this state of equanimity. Now, the idea is that I think we want to avoid harm. And how do we do that? Again, Buddhist philosophy does have some answer for us here, which is why I thought to bring up Enlightenment. Because it is known, I think this is self-evident, so I think they're right, that we all live in this state of ceaseless striving. And that is the father or the genesis of suffering. This is again something that the Buddhist scholars have thought about for the longest time. Some Western philosophers have as well. Arthur Schopenhauer obviously comes to mind. Because we are desiring beings, we are beings that desire. We are necessarily beings that suffer because desire is suffering. When you have a desire and that desire is not satisfied, you suffer. Right? You could be hungry, you could be thirsty. You could have desire for a nice studio like this one and then don't have it at home because you're too poor to afford one. And then you're like, oh man, like I suffer, right? So that's an example that we are suffering beings. And I think that's where our stronger moral duties lie, to avoid the suffering than to pursue pleasure.
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to do a divide here because I think it's important. And I would love to actually hear what you have to say on this too, because I think we've had so many interesting conversations on this individually. The first one is I would definitely separate pain from suffering, because I think pain isn't the only path to suffering. I think we can have good things happen to us and we can still suffer, right? It's just the perspective that we have on that, right? We have very good examples of people winning the lottery and then calling the worst thing they've ever had, right? It was definitely not a pain by any stretch of the imagination. No one has harmed them, right? But because of the perspective, right, it can be perceived as harm, which then be perceived as suffering. So I love that you brought Buddhism into this as well. I've been studying Buddhism so much recently because I love Buddhism. I think like, I like all sorts of like, like anything that survived like millennia probably has some truth to it.
Yeah, and something going for it.
So what I like to do is like kind of look into like what was good and kind of sift through, all the additional things that got layered on. And I think one thing that I really love about Buddhism is that pain doesn't have to be suffering. Like, and I repeat that all the time to myself as well, to remind myself that, I think pain actually is an interesting driver towards flow states. Because I think if you didn't have pain, right, if I wasn't having a challenge to deal with, I wouldn't be in a flow state, because my flow state comes when I'm dealing with a challenge and kicking ass at it, right? Like solving the problem. But would I say that I could easily have that flow state be turned into a suffering state? Absolutely, right? If instead I was like wallowing, like, oh, why do I have to do this? Like, it's so stupid. Like, why can't people just solve their problem? Why? If I go into that state, 100% that turns into suffering. And I think absolutely we should, as a society, try to limit that, right? I think a lot of what we're doing here is trying to communicate to people that, hey, this doesn't have to be suffering, right? Think about it from a different perspective. Potentially things might be different. And I think that's like the really important point here. And I think maybe to jump to Jess, like, what's your experience with that? Because I think we've had many situations where, we have turned pain to suffering. Yeah.
I think for me, growing up, pain was tolerable for me because I followed the system where this is worth it in the end. Or I followed the system where, hey, it's going to lead to something. So, this pain doesn't matter. But I think that only works if there's a clear direction or why for that pain. And then I think it's just like if you're enduring pain, but like not really knowing why, that's when it turns more into suffering.
Yeah, I think, so some ways to flesh this out, right? I think number one is I'm reminded of what Ludwig Wittgenstein said, that all philosophy is language games. Because when we say pain, we don't just mean physical or mental pain. We just mean like any negative state to be in. So in some cases, we can imagine pain as being synonymous to suffering, right? In that sense. But that's the pedantry out of it, right? We ascribe meaning to different, again, levels of pain or suffering or harm. Let's just use the word harm, right? We ascribe different levels to the kind of harms that we are capable of suffering, just as we ascribe different levels of pleasure that we are capable of suffering. So some aestheticists, I think that's the word, say that there is a type of pleasure that is only attainable in a state of complete inspiration. And there is, I don't know what the word is for it because I'm not well versed in this at all. But they gave some examples, right? So they said like beholding Mount Everest in person, beholding basically any view of absolute majestic beauty. Is something that leads to this type of pleasure that is not attainable elsewhere. Right. And this would explain why people would spend all this money and effort to see the Northern Lights and not just have a screensaver on the computer. Right? Because there's an additional value to seeing the Northern Lights in real life than not in real life, but through a synthetic means. So I think, again, to think again about pain is that certainly we can choose rationally to pursue pain. Now, what do I mean by that?
Yeah.
Well, the easiest way to think about it is if pain's worth it, right? Like I work really hard on my PhD because I think that being able to graduate with my PhD is a worthwhile goal.
Yeah.
So what's happening here is that there seems to be some sort of calculus where there is a temporally insensitive kind of pleasure that I'm after.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not necessarily thinking only about pain and pleasure right now. I'm thinking about pain and pleasure in some future time frame.
Yeah. You've delayed gratification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one way to put it, right? So it could be the case that I perform an action that increases my suffering right now, and that action that I perform would still be completely morally acceptable or even morally obligatory, right? Like if I saw a child drowning in a very shallow pond, and I know that I can wade into the pond, but the child's too small, and I could save that child at the cost of my really nice pair of shoes, I should save that child, right? Because I would prevent a large amount of harm to come to that child, even though some suffering comes to me in the sense that I lose my really fancy shoes.
Sure.
So this is an argument by Peter Singer in his famous 1970-something article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, that I think every moral philosopher has read like dozens of times by now. So that's one way to think about it. I think there's the amount of suffering that we could avoid by looking through our actions, by looking through how we view the world and how we interact with the world is something that's super important to me. And I think that's the main way, I think, to bring it all together. This moral system has taught me how I kind of view and interact with the world, and it informs my even my inner dialogues. Yeah.
And in a sense, that's your system.
Yeah. Right?
Your personal system.
And I feel like at the very least, I perceive that this system is great for me.
Sure.
It's something that is choice-worthy to have, which then again brings me back to my original statement that, hey, maybe not all systems are bad, and they're just here to like look out for you and like surveil you. No, I think that there are cases where systems are great, and I think this is one of them. Having a strong moral system that you think is defensible is something that I think is really underrated in our lives.
Yeah, making your own system, making a mental model for yourself, heuristics, so to speak, right? That can solve and calculate, the problems in your life to the highest degree that you can, right? And then ultimately being able to utilize that to make good decisions. And I think the best thing is to be able to change your mind on things, right? Being open-minded enough to like tweak it when new evidence comes.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think that's absolutely, what we're talking about here.
That's something that so the reason why I initially said that my colleagues and I joke a lot about coming out of the closet as a utilitarian is because prior to recent years, I've basically spent most of my time thinking about virtue ethics more than I have about utilitarianism. So not to get into all the technical stuff, but effectively, I thought that morality comprised in character traits more than consequences. I thought that consequences can't be the be all end all of morality. Until I realized that why I valued these character traits was really the consequences. Right?
Yeah.
Being patient, being kind, being courageous, all that stuff in the right doses, obviously,
Sure.
Led to desirable consequences. And so yeah, a lot of thought went into this. But I think something really interesting that happens is that the more thought you put into something, the less confident you become in that system.
Yeah.
Right. Like if someone came up to me and said, I think negative utilitarianism is wrong, here's why, and they give me an argument that I cannot defeat,
Sure.
I would actually be quite happy to entertain the thought of changing my worldview.
That's awesome.
And we have to be that way, given how much we've developed as a human species. Communities have developed. We no longer are allowed to just sit down and say, well, this is the way things have always been done, therefore this is the choice-worthy way to do it. No, I think if the way you're doing things is stupid, I should be able to tell you that I think it's stupid. Sure. And here's why I think it's stupid. If you think it's not stupid, you should convince me why it's not stupid. But until then, I have reasons to believe that the way you do things is stupid. So here's why we shouldn't be doing that. So that's kind of the whole conversation that you have not just internally, but also with the outside world, with people that you interact with.
You have to interact with people in this world. Absolutely.
And I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. Like if I came here and say, hey, Conrad, I think the way you do this podcast is really dumb. Like,
Maybe, could be.
yeah, as an example, I can't say I know anything about this. But, if that's the example, right? If I for some reason was some expert in like podcast production, and I came here and say, hey, I think that this way, the way you arrange these flowers are really dumb. Now, if I just came here and I said that, I would just be an ass. But if I told you why I thought that the way these flowers are arranged are bad, or why your podcast setup is not good, why and how you would be able to do it better, then you would have more reasons to think that, hey, maybe this guy is onto something. And you think that, well, okay, whatever he said makes sense. I think I shouldn't have been doing this anyway. Let me change the way I've been doing things.
Sure.
I think that's how we progress, and that's how this whole like cyclical idea of systems perpetuating themselves and being self-correcting in that sense, perhaps would be a very useful way to think about how we can interact with the world.
I love that. And I think that's actually a really good like kind of wrapper to everything. And thank you for kind of structuring it like that. I think maybe as a conclusion to this episode, we can get each of us to kind of share our personal system now. And I think you've shared yours, which is fantastic. Thank you for that.
Yep.
And maybe Jess, you can share a bit about like what you think your personal system is. How do you deal with life?
Whoa,
that's a very loaded question.
Big question. Yeah.
I think how I deal with it now is to do my best every day. So plan a few things and I just do them. And then regardless of what happens or how I feel, if I think it's important enough, then I will just do it first, because I think action kind of will give me more answers than just sitting there and thinking and keeping on planning.
I like that. And I think for me, like, there's so much I like in the sense that like I think everything has so much value, and I don't necessarily subscribe to only one way of seeing the world. I think like you, I'm very open to many different views and many different ways to be challenged. But one thing I keep coming back to, I think, is what is the pursuit of everything? And for me, the pursuit is fulfillment, right? How do I put myself in a state where I am feeling this Zen, peace, right? Not necessarily chasing after immediate gratification, and in a sense, actually chasing pain, right? Because I think pain gives me a lot of opportunity to pursue growth paths that will give me opportunities to be in the flow state. So, and then minimizing opportunities to turn anything into suffering, because I think anybody has a capacity and capability to turn anything, any situation into a bad thing, right? Yeah. And I think for me, the more I can see life from that lens, the happier I am overall. And I think going to the point of like, hey, at what point do you give feedback, right? At what point do you take your internal dialogue and say, hey, you should think this way too, right? I think it's all about packaging, really, because I think, using the exact example, if you came in guns blazing, like, hey, this sucks, I think that's a very different view than be like, hey, you know what? I like what you've tried doing here, right? I get the intention. Maybe X, Y, and Z things could be the things that you change about this that could improve this whole process. And I think humans are so funny, like the way that things are packaged and the way that things are perceived can just change the inner dialogue so much on how you perceive that to be like, is that a positive thing they're saying to me? Or is that something they're trying to do to help me? Or is that something they're trying to do to harm me? And that goes back to the whole thing of like harming is such a loaded concept, because anything can be harm. Anything can be perceived as harm. Something you think you're doing for your partner that you think is very wonderful and they're going to praise you and they'll love you for it. Hey, they hate it, And that's a very common occurrence.
No, you're exactly right. So obviously being a moral philosopher, people do think that you are, supposed to be privy to all these moral reasons to do things.
Sure.
And all like, you've had this like sage-like wisdom as to what it's like, what is the answer to, life, the universe, and everything else in the world.
Right.
Well, the way I see it is, so that I hold very negative utilitarian intuitions. So the way I tell people about my view is that, well, I think I subscribe to the idea that by virtue of our existence, we all suffer, and we are suffering.
Sure.
The least you could do is not to increase that suffering. Right? Like,
sure.
So,
absolutely.
So to put it colloquially, like, increasing the suffering in the world is kind of a dick move, man.
I'm gonna use that as the quote for the thumbnail.
Yeah, like so obviously it's part of my career.
Yeah.
I've had to talk a lot about these things, right?
Yes.
So the way I think about it is, well, the least you could do is reduce that suffering, I think. So okay, no, scratch that. The least you could do is not to increase that suffering.
Yes.
The next thing you could do on top of that is reduce that suffering.
Absolutely.
Right. And then anything above and beyond that, it's really just like increasing pleasure, whatever have you. Like, I think those things are great if you can do them. If you can't, then sure. You are not a bad person in as much as you do not increase the amount of suffering in the world.
Absolutely.
Which then becomes the most important kind of thing that you're thinking about all the time. Because, for example, choosing which shirt to wear could be a moral situation, right?
Okay.
Well, did I buy this shirt that was made in a sweatshop? In which case, then I'm perpetuating the suffering of all these children.
Sure.
When you're on the bus, should I give up this seat? Well, would this person suffer more than I would if I stood up and this person sat down?
Yeah.
Or vice versa, right? Would I suffer more by standing up than this person suffering for standing up?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, how I view the world. It could, some of my colleagues again have said that this is a really depressing way to live life because all you're thinking about all the time, you're obsessing over suffering. But I think that seems to be the thing that is worthy of that obsession. I think it's worthy of that kind of requirement for us to dodge, I think. So it's one way I'd put it. I think it's not the most elegant way to put it, but it's one way I'd put it.
Love it. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us for this amazing talk. Really appreciate it. And if anybody wants to join in on the conversation, please let us know in the comments below what you think about this podcast, this episode, and I think moral philosophy as a whole. Maybe tell us what your position on this all is. What is your system in which you view life, and I guess your philosophy, so to speak, right? Is definitely how I'd say it. And we'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.